Now let's look more specifically at this couple decades between the 60s and 80s that were the real heart of this carceral explosion. As we mentioned, sees the beginnings for this certainly in the 40s during the war and post-war period. But let's just kind of give a broad scope of what was going on at the time. So, of course, you had the civil rights movement, but also the Cold War, specifically Vietnam. So there was this general social unrest, domestic and global, that contributed to and created a sense of anxiety, a sense of fear. And this is something that both the media and politicians exploited. Crime in the 70s, was something that was problematic. And if you remember looking at those graphs of crime rate and incarceration rate, as the incarceration rate goes up in the 70s, the crime rate starts to go down. So, and we've looked at a lot of the studies on the causes of that, especially by the Brennan Institute, and it had really nothing to do with these law and order policies, these incarceration policies. That had more to do probably with economic inclusion, things that address the systemic origins of crime and criminalization of populations. But in the 70s, there was this, in the 60s and 70s, a general unrest. But in the 70s, you even had the sensationalization and, quite frankly, the romanticization of certain serial killers. So this was the Son of Sam, Charles Manson. All of those things were going on at this time. And the fear-mongering and the xenophobia are certainly not new, and not new to media. Yellow journalism, all of these kinds of things that those of you who are interested in media and sensationalization are aware of that. But much of this was extremely exacerbated by the ubiquity of television. So I'm going to take a slight detour into some data about TV viewership, but hopefully to come back and get us to these moments where crime and punishment and law and order politics are used as the major ways in which both Republicans and Democrats campaigned at this time, and the ways in which those issues rhetorically, but also in practice, became central to the identity of that administration.
One hand behind my back. Well, I wonder what Betty Fernandez is going to do with one hand behind her back like that.
Come with me, and I'll show you what every one of you can do single-handed. Here, you can tune in this wonderful new Westinghouse television set with just one hand like this, because it has the sensational new Westinghouse single-dial control. There's no more fussing with several dials. You just turn this one dial, and you're tuned in perfectly.
So if we look at some data about television, we can see how the growing ubiquity of access to television contributed to the ways in which we sensationalize crime and the criminal. So in 1946, the year after the war, less than 1%, only 0.5% of households had a television. 1954, so 8 years later, over half, 55.7%, had a television in their home. And then 8 years after that, 90% of households had a television in their home. So in this roughly 20-year period, you go from less than 1% to 90% having televisions in their household. Now, of course, we could jump ahead to now, where not only do we have a television in the household, there's two or three, there's one in each room. I doubt for many of you there's a room that doesn't have a screen in it. Freudian slip, a scream. But now we also carry our TVs and our screens and our media with us in our pockets. So, we could tell that story and it would be an interesting story. But by 62, 90% had televisions in their household. And, it wasn't simply the media and the news that were part of this problem. It was also the ways in which ideas about American identity and American value were pumped into the homes, into the living rooms, and these were things that unconsciously and consciously shaped our view of reality. So I'm going to focus on one of those as a way of setting up the type of ideal world, or the type of world that maybe some persons strive to attain or lived in, that they saw was crumbling when shown these images of a lot of the social unrest that was going on in the 60s and 70s. And the major kind of moment I want to look at is the show Leave It to Beaver.
Leave It to Beaver. Starring Barbara Billingsley, Hugh Beaumont, Tony Dow, and Jerry Mathers, and Jerry Mathers, and Jerry Mathers, and Jerry Mathers, and Jerry Mathers as the Beaver. As the Beaver.
Basically, what you saw is an all-white family, an all-white suburban family, an all-white bourgeois suburban family, an all-white bourgeois heteronormative family that, was mowing the lawn and had their tea. And so it was this reinforcing this idea of the family and the American ideal and the American dream and what it meant to be a successful American. So when a lot of these things started to happen with Vietnam, with the civil rights movement, with the assassination of JFK, with the assassination of MLK, with a lot of the uprisings and unrest that were occurring in the late 60s, this was the kind of ideal that was seen as crumbling. And so Nixon played on this in a very Machiavellian and in a very brilliant way, insofar as it's brilliant to exploit these things to consolidate power. And so when we watch the ad for the first civil right, I want you to keep in mind that world, that ideal world that was in the background of a lot of the idea of American consciousness.